Ford spent 4 years hiding how badly its electric vehicle bet was failing, using a corporate restructuring that most of Wall Street cheered as a stroke of genius. And that decision is the reason Ford just posted its worst net loss since the 2008 financial crisis. In February 2026, Ford told investors it had lost $8.2 billion in a single year. Buried inside that number was a business unit that had bled money every single quarter since the day Ford started reporting it on its own. 4 years earlier, in March 2022, Ford had done something no other legacy automaker had tried. It split itself into 2 distinct companies under one roof. One side would keep building the trucks and SUVs that had made Ford profitable for a century. The other would chase electric vehicles with its own leadership, its own targets, and eventually its own separate financial statements. Ford called it transparency. Wall Street called it a masterstroke. The stock jumped that same day, and analysts lined up to praise the move. This was, after all, a 120-year-old company that had just survived the 2008 financial crisis without a government bailout, splitting off a brand new electric vehicle division with the confidence of a business that expected nothing but growth ahead of it. Nobody on that call thought they were watching the opening move of a slow-motion collapse. This is the story of how one restructuring decision let Ford delay a reckoning that arrived anyway, $19 billion later, and what it actually cost the company to keep pretending it hadn't. To understand why the split mattered, you have to understand what Ford actually was before any of this started. For most of the 20th century, Ford wasn't just a car company. It was the company that put America on wheels. The Model T did it in 1908. The F-150 did it for the next 4 decades, becoming the best-selling vehicle in the United States year after year. Ford's combustion business, later renamed Ford Blue, wasn't just profitable. It was one of the most reliable profit engines in American industry, throwing off billions in free cash flow largely on the back of trucks. That cash is what let Ford survive 2008 without a government bailout, unlike General Motors and Chrysler. It's also what gave CEO Jim Farley the confidence, in 2022, to make an enormous bet. He wanted Ford to lead the shift to electric vehicles the same way it had once led the shift to the assembly line. If you're new to this channel, this is exactly the kind of story we dig into every week. The real numbers behind the headlines, the financial media won't slow down to explain. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Farley's plan required serious money. Ford committed $50 billion to electrification through 2026, nearly double what it had promised a year earlier. Spending that kind of money quietly, buried inside one combined income statement, was going to be a problem eventually. So Ford decided not to hide the spending. It decided to name it. On March 2nd, 2022, Ford announced it was breaking itself into 3 customer-facing units. Ford Blue would keep building the gas and hybrid vehicles that funded everything else. Ford Pro would handle commercial trucks and vans, and Ford Model E, a new division built around electric vehicles and software, would get its own leadership, its own budget, and starting in 2023, its own profit and loss statement. Farley put himself at the head of Model E personally, while handing Ford Blue to longtime executive Kumar Galhotra. He recruited Doug Field, a former Apple and Tesla engineering leader, to run Model E's product development. Chief Transformation Officer Stuart Rowley told investors plainly what the arrangement actually was. He said, "Ford Blue is going to be the profit engine of Ford." In other words, the century-old gasoline business would be paying the bills so the electric vehicle business could grow without financial constraints. Analysts loved it. Bank of America called it a smart move. Jefferies called it creative. Ford's stock jumped more than 8%, closing at $18.10 a share. For the first time, investors were promised they'd get to see exactly how the electric vehicle business was performing, standing entirely on its own. Full transparency, Ford said, starting the following year. Nobody in that press conference asked what would happen once that transparency actually produced a number. In 12 months, it would produce its first one, and it was a number so large that Ford would spend the next 3 years trying to explain it away. That number arrived in February 2024, when Ford reported its first full year of separated financials. Ford Model E had generated $5.9 billion in revenue in 2023, up 12% from the year before. That sounded like growth. But underneath the revenue line, Model E had posted an operating loss of $4.7 billion in a single year. Ford had sold about 116,000 electric vehicles in 2023. Divide the loss by the units sold, and Ford had lost an average of just over $40,000 on every single electric vehicle it put on the road. That was just the average for the whole year. By the fourth quarter alone, the per-vehicle loss had climbed past $47,000. Ford Blue, meanwhile, had earned $7.5 billion in profit that same year, more than enough to cover Model E's losses twice over. This is the dynamic almost nobody outside Ford's own finance department fully understood. As long as Ford Blue and Ford Pro kept generating enough profit, the combined company could report a healthy adjusted number to Wall Street every quarter, even while Model E bled billions underneath it. Picture two siblings sharing a checking account. One works a steady job and pays the bills. The other keeps starting businesses that lose money, and the working sibling just keeps covering the overdraft. From the outside, looking only at the joint balance, everything looks fine. It's only when you open the individual statements that you see one sibling is drowning. Ford had just shown investors those individual statements for the first time, and the drowning was already worse than anyone expected. Ford told investors the 2023 loss was a growing pain, not a warning sign. It projected Model E's losses would widen slightly in 2024 to somewhere between $5 and $5.5 billion as the company kept investing in next-generation electric vehicles. What Ford didn't fully prepare investors for was how bad a single quarter could get. In the first quarter of 2024, Model E sold just 10,000 vehicles, down 20% from a year earlier. Revenue collapsed 84% to roughly $100 million, as price cuts across the entire EV industry gutted margins. The operating loss for that one quarter alone was $1.3 billion. Divide that loss across the 10,000 vehicles sold, and Ford had lost roughly $132,000 on every electric vehicle sold in the first 3 months of the year alone. Chief Financial Officer John Lawler tried to explain it to reporters. He said, "Revenue is dropping faster than we can take out the cost." Ford had already cut about $5,000 in cost out of every Mustang Mach-E. It didn't matter. The price war was outrunning every efficiency gain the company could find. The checking account from a year earlier was starting to break down, because the sibling covering the bills was about to run into problems of its own. Ford Blue's own profit was about to start shrinking too. Nobody at Ford said so publicly yet, but the math was already moving in a direction that would make the next decision far more expensive than anyone in Dearborn wanted to admit. By 2024, Ford Blue's profit had in fact started to slide, falling from $7.5 billion in 2023 to $5.3 billion, while its margin dropped from 7.3% to 5.2%. The sibling paying the bills was earning less, right as the other sibling's losses widened to $5.1 billion for the full year. Executives kept making promises anyway. Lawler had told investors in 2024 that Ford intended for EV pricing to eventually cover its actual production costs within 12 months. That promise quietly expired unmet. By February 2025, Ford's newly elevated Chief Financial Officer Sherry House was telling investors something that sounded almost identical to what her predecessor had said the year before. She said Ford expected another loss of $5 to $5.5 billion for Model E, holding losses stable year over year. Stable was the word Ford's own finance chief used to describe $5 billion of continued bleeding. It wasn't a turnaround. It was a plateau, dressed up as progress. Behind the scenes, Ford had already quietly cancelled a planned 3-row electric SUV in April 2024, taking a charge that started at $400 million and was expected to grow to as much as $1.5 billion. Nobody at Ford said this out loud yet, but that projection was about to prove far too optimistic. The 3-row SUV wasn't the only casualty of Ford's electric vehicle strategy. It was just the first, and it was about to look small. The 3-row SUV cancellation eventually cost Ford $1.2 billion by the time the final numbers came in for 2025, nearly triple the original estimate. But that turned out to be the smaller problem. Ford's electric vehicle strategy depended heavily on a joint venture called BlueOval SK, built with South Korea's SK On to produce batteries at plants in Kentucky and Tennessee. In December 2025, that partnership fell apart. SK On walked away from the arrangement entirely. Ford was left owning the Kentucky battery plants outright, while SK On kept the Tennessee facility for itself. The Tennessee site that was supposed to build Ford's next-generation electric pickup, previously called the Tennessee Electric Vehicle Center, had to be renamed the Tennessee Truck Plant because it would now build gasoline-powered trucks instead. This wasn't a single bad decision anymore. It was the entire foundation of Ford's electric vehicle manufacturing plan coming apart at once. The battery partner, the flagship factory, and the vehicle it was built to produce, all unraveling in the same month. Andrew Frick, president of Ford's Model E and Ford Blue businesses, tried to frame the retreat as strategic clarity. He said, "Ford is following the customer." What he didn't say was that Ford had spent 4 years and tens of billions of dollars following a customer that, according to Ford's own sales numbers, was buying far fewer large electric vehicles than the company had bet on. The federal government made the customer's decision easier. When the $7,500 EV tax credit expired at the end of September 2025, national EV sales fell about 40% the following month. By the time this collapse was finished, there would be no version of Ford's original electric vehicle strategy left standing to defend. On December the 15th, 2025, Ford made it official. The company announced $19.5 billion in special charges tied entirely to its electric vehicle strategy. $8.5 billion came from cancelling EV programs outright. $6 billion came from unwinding the SK On battery partnership. $5 billion came from what Ford simply called program-related expenses. Ford ended production of the F-150 Lightning, the electric pickup it had once called the future of the brand. In its place, Ford announced a new electric truck with a gasoline generator built in, a workaround for a fully electric promise that hadn't worked out. Ford said it now expected Model E to become profitable by 2029, 7 years after the original split was announced. It wasn't only the electric vehicle bet dragging the company down that quarter. Fires at an aluminium supplier called Novelis had cost Ford up to $2 billion in lost output, on top of $2 billion in tariff cost for the year. 2 months later, the full scale of the damage became public. Ford's fourth quarter net loss came to $11.1 billion. Its full-year net loss for 2025 reached $8.2 billion, the worst result Ford had posted since the 2008 financial crisis. Model E alone had lost $4.8 billion for the year, an average of roughly $27,000 on every electric vehicle it sold. Sherry House told investors flatly that Ford did not expect to break even on electric vehicles until 2029. Jim Farley still tried to put a positive frame on it. He said, "Ford delivered a strong 2025 in a dynamic and often volatile environment. A company that had just posted its worst loss since the Great Recession was calling it strong. The transparency Ford had promised back in 2022 had finally delivered a number. It just wasn't the number anyone wanted. So what actually went wrong? It came down to 3 mistakes. First, Ford mistook separate financial statements for genuine accountability. Reporting Model E's losses on their own line didn't force anyone to act on them faster. It just made the losses easier to describe as an investment instead of a failure for 4 straight years. Second, Ford let its profitable divisions quietly absorb a bet that kept getting worse. Ford Blue and Ford Pro's combined profits meant the parent company's headline numbers never looked bad enough to force an early correction, so a losing strategy got to run for years longer than it should have. Third, splitting the company in 2 never actually contained the damage. It only delayed it. When the reckoning finally came, in December 2025, and again in February 2026, it arrived all at once. $19.5 billion in charges and the worst net loss Ford had posted since 2008. The split gave Ford's electric vehicle failure its own name and its own financial statement. It never gave it a plan to actually stop losing money, not until the losses became too large to keep calling temporary. By the first quarter of 2026, the losses had narrowed to $777 million. Still red ink, but moving in the right direction for the first time in 4 years. Whether that's the start of an actual recovery or just a smaller version of the same story is still an open question. If this kind of story, the real financial mechanics hiding behind a corporate press release, is what you come here for, Subscribe because next week we're covering a company that used its own accounting to hide a problem even bigger than Ford's. That story is coming next.